Thank you so much, Professor Toma, and just everyone at WGSS for having me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with all of you, and so sorry that I missed the student presentations, all of which looked really exciting. So I'm going to be asking for those papers if it's possible to read them at another time. And just grateful to be with you all today. Wanted to begin by dedicating tonight's conversation to Tony McDade, a Black trans man killed by Tallahassee police just a few days after George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police, and to Breonna Bibi Hill, a Black trans woman who was beaten violently by Kansas City police and then killed by a community member in a related, which feels to me like a related incident in the sense that if a community member sees what's happening on the right, then it's a fairly clear message that the state will not protect this person, and in fact is open season to harm them. And Breonna, like so many Black trans women already in 2020, was killed by a community member in October of 2019. So I wanted to dedicate tonight's conversation to both of them as Black trans people who have been killed by police or by state-sanctioned violence in recent months. And wanted to start by lifting up the words of one of your hometown scholars, Dean Spade, who recently wrote a piece for the Abolition for the People series sponsored by Colin Kaepernick on Medium. I encourage folks to read every single piece in the series. I'm very honored and privileged to be invited to contribute to the series, but frankly, every other piece in the series is the one that you should read. Dean really sort of lays out some of the case for why we need to have queer dreams of abolition futures, why abolition is a necessity for queer liberation, why queer liberation is essential to abolition. And so the first piece that he lays out, obviously, is the fact that the reason that abolition is essential to queer liberation is that queer people are experience very, very, very high levels of police violence in police interactions. And that's particularly true for trans and gender nonconforming people, and particularly true for Black and brown and migrant and disabled trans and gender nonconforming people. And I think that there might be a sense that this is, at least among some folks, certainly not everyone, but among some people, that this is a relatively new phenomenon that maybe sort of started happening around the time of Stonewall. And that's why Stonewall was a rebellion against police violence. But in fact, it's something that, as we outline in another book that I had the privilege of co-authoring with Joey Mogul and Kay Whitlock, is actually instrumental to the history of the United States and to the history of policing. And so we argue in Queer Injustice, and I reiterate in Invisible No More, that the policing of gender and sexuality in the larger context of policing of colonialism and chattel slavery is inherent to policing itself and is inherent to the carceral state and the construction of carcerality itself. And so Claire Sears, for instance, makes the case very compellingly in Arresting Dress around how the very first sort of urban police forces that were set up, in addition to being charged with capturing runaway enslaved people and keeping indigenous people who had been removed from their own land and incarcerated on reservations out of cities occupied by white settlers, a co-current function of police departments from the very beginning and from their inception was to police gender and sexuality in public space, and to do that by literally policing the borders of the gender binary, through cross-dressing laws, and also through laws around prostitution and lewd conduct. And to the extent that anyone was perceived to be transgressing gender or sexual binaries or norms, they were immediately deemed suspect and removed from public space. And certainly Arresting Dress talks about how that was disproportionately experienced by Black and brown trans and gender nonconforming people, including Geraldine Portica, who is the person on the cover who's a Mexican national who was arrested in San Francisco for cross-dressing and deported. And so that essentially is a process that begins in the early 1900s when urban police forces become more prevalent across the country, and is consistent throughout history. So for instance, in fact, in this case, Mary Jones was arrested in 1836. Mary Jones had been arrested many times for allegedly, what was called cross-dressing, or wearing attire that wasn't consistent with gender assigned at birth. And in this case had been arrested at the time that she was then incarcerated at Sing Sing in, an incident connected to the sex trade in which she was accused basically of rolling a client, of taking money from a client. And much was made at the trial, as you can see from this very offensive poster, that of her gender and gender identity. And what was important to note about her case as well is that she very much resisted that particular aspect of her criminalization. Her trial became for her a point of resistance, and articulating that she lived in her community as Mary Jones, she was accepted in her community as Mary Jones, and that what was happening was a white supremacist effort to challenge, to criminalize her based on her gender and gender identity, as well as her race. She unfortunately spent 5 years in Sing Sing, where she experienced tremendous amounts of violence. And her story has been recently retold in a film by Tourmaline, a Black trans filmmaker, who also is a leading thinker and fighter in queer abolition, who has taught me much of what I know about abolition through a Black queer trans lens. Made a film about Mary Jones called Salacia, and I encourage folks who are able to access it for educational purposes to do so for your classrooms or for larger constituencies, which retells the Mary Jones story from her perspective, obviously. Cross-dressing laws are something I think people are more familiar with in sort of the 60s and 70s as one of the means by which policing and criminalization of queer and trans identities took place. Some folks say that the raid at Stonewall happened because it was an alcohol license pretext, but really that it was police who hadn't gotten their extortion money. Other folks say that the police raided Stonewall because there was rumors of men or women dressed in men's clothing and people dancing with each other who were of the same gender. In any event, certainly was a way in which policing happened very clearly in the 50s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and which also was a site of resistance from Black trans women, not only at Stonewall, as we know, or at Compton's Cafeteria or Cooper's Donuts in LA and San Francisco, but also by trans folks who, like Sir Lady Java, who is still engaged in resistance to this day, and mounted an unsuccessful, unfortunately, lawsuit against cross-dressing law when she was arrested at a club that she was performing at. And so these laws have always existed. The criminalization of queer and trans people has always existed. The use of criminalization to police the gender binary and the acceptable norms of sexual behavior has been consistent throughout time, and has also been consistently a site of resistance. And so, in addition to being an example of how not to do a PowerPoint slide, this is the definition of criminalization that Dr. Beth Ritchie, my sister in struggle and not in family, we spell our last names differently, came up with for the report that Professor Toma mentioned earlier around the crisis of criminalization, where we talk about the fact that criminalization, sure, is certainly a process of criminal laws by which the state decides, what kind of conduct will be punished by whom and when and in what form. And that is framed as an ostensibly neutral process, but in the end, as we all know, not all behavior is punished the same depending on who's engaged in it. The most obvious example is that murder is not consistently criminalized. If the president drops a bomb or drone on Yemen, that's considered not even an act of murder or killing, it's considered an act of national security. We've seen countless police officers kill people and have that not be deemed any kind of crime. So, and then meanwhile, people who kill folks in self-defense, and we'll talk more about that later on, particularly trans and queer folks like CC McDonald who defend themselves are very much criminalized when other folks who engage in self-defense are not. And so in the end, even when you think about it in terms of criminal law, criminalization is very much a political and social process that is created to uphold existing relations of power and reinforce, again, sort of racialized gender binaries, racialized notions of sexual deviance and sexual promiscuity, and to reinforce social colonial relations and racial capitalist relations of power. And in that process, it ends up being not so much about laws that are being discriminatorily enforced, but could be objectively enforced, that things could be reformed to be made more equal. It actually becomes a political process of creating certain categories of people who are deemed inherently criminal. And then you sort of tell a story that feeds that so that even as certain laws are repealed and replaced and changed, that same group of people keeps being criminalized over and over again. And so we certainly see that when it comes to queer and trans people. These cross-dressing laws I was talking about earlier have been struck down. Laws around sodomy, at least in private by consenting adults who don't exchange money, those laws have been struck down. But the reality is that queer and trans people continue to be criminalized under different laws, under the same stories about them. So one of the graphics in the report talks about how, sure, laws and policies are part of what are used to criminalize people, but also these stories are the other half of the octopus eye, or the other half of the octopus, and that the ways in which the laws and stories are used in combination work in service of the ocean in which they operate, of colonialism, white supremacy, capitalism, gender oppression, and so forth, ableism. And so you see, for instance, the notion that queer and trans people are sexual predators were considered, that was the story that was created as justification for policing queer and trans people on the streets under sodomy laws, under cross-dressing laws, under prostitution laws. Ultimately, those laws have been struck down, but we'll see that queer and trans people continue to be criminalized under that narrative using different laws. The same is true about, whether people with HIV spread disease. Queer and trans people are disease spreaders. Those same stories get used over and over again, even as certain laws get struck down and others take their place. So that's the process that we'll be talking about tonight when we think about why we need to have queer dreams of abolitionist futures. It's that there's not one law that we can get rid of. There's not one kind of reform that we can engage in, that we get better judges, that we do have a better Supreme Court justice, that we don't have that one, that we have this one, that we have a different president, that we have a different sort of police force, that we have different structures. The same stories will continue to be used to criminalize people in service of the same structural relations of power. And ultimately, it's the reason that we need to completely dismantle the system and the stories and the values that produce the system, and reimagine a future in which we are not criminalizing people along those lines and not maintaining those relations of power through the criminal punishment system. So what that means is that, police interactions with individual queer and trans people are very much shaped by those stories, by those narratives, criminalizing narratives and relations of power. And as you know, once a person is criminalized or deemed inherently criminal, then you can pretty much do anything to them, right? You can put them in a cage, you can keep them in solitary for 25 years, you can take away all their rights, you can subject them to systemic and structural rape in prison, or you can shoot them dead in the street. And that's in fact what has happened for Jihad Akbar. Was a Black gay man who was killed in the streets of San Francisco. He was in the middle of, I think, what could be described as an alternate reality at the time. But he was dancing and singing outside of a place called the Baghdad Cafe. The police showed up. They saw that he had two butter knives in his hands and shot him dead in the street. And in that moment, they're seeing a Black gay man, so a Black person, inherently dangerous. He's gay, gender nonconforming, inherently dangerous, inherently threatening, inherently predatory, inherently diseased. And then they're seeing also a disabled person, and we should say up front that ableism is intricately engaged in all of these systems around gender, sexual, and bodily conformity, and that often laws around policing cross-dressing, policing prostitution, and what were called ugly laws, which were about removing disabled bodies from public spaces, were all in the same part of the criminal code, in municipal criminal codes. And Claire Sears talks about how police were charged with enforcing those kind of inextricably as a web. Just go out in the streets and clear the streets of disabled people, queer people, trans people, people engaged in depraved sexual activity, and make them safe for white women, basically, to walk through and feel like it's a moral, clear space. So all of those stories converge when police officers saw a gay, Black, disabled man, and instead of saying, what's going on with this person, how might me engage with this person in a way that would preserve their life, that would value their life, that would lift up their humanity, they just shot him dead in the street. So those stories were also operating when police responded to a call that was actually intended to just reach the mental health hotline and the mental health responders in Berkeley. Kayla Moore was a Black trans woman who was, with her roommate. Her roommate was her caretaker. At some point, he felt like her connection with reality was, he just needed some help responding to her. By the time the police got there, she was fine. She was cooking dinner. But again, the police saw a Black woman, saw her as inherently deranged and dangerous in narratives rooted in chattel slavery, saw a Black trans person who is also inherently conceived to be or perceived to be disabled in a mental disability, and and that's still to this day, gender identity disorder is named as a disability, as a medical condition, and that is one that people assume that means that people are not clear about who they are and they're inherently unstable, and also as a disabled person who had previously had a mental health diagnosis. Police responded, instead of assisting her, by first assuming that a warrant for someone who had her the name assigned to her at birth, who was actually 20 years older than her, was hers. And she said, there's no warrant out for me, you're wrong. And let's just call the FBI and confirm that. And in that moment, the officers were like, no, you don't, we're seeing you through these narratives, these criminalizing narratives, and instead piled on top of her and asphyxiated her. And then refused to offer her life-saving resuscitation because they were transphobic and didn't want to give her mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, and said as much using transphobic slurs. So again, these historic narratives, these criminalizing narratives, then converge in police interactions with queer and trans people, including in situations where someone might need assistance. Same was true for Michelle Cusseau, a Black lesbian whose mother called to just ask for assistance, again, getting her daughter to get some medical help. Instead, the police broke down her door, or tried to. They then went away for a second. So she came back with a hammer to try and fix the door because someone had just tried to break down the door in her house. And when the cop came back and saw her at the door with a hammer trying to fix it, he said the look on her face made him feel in danger for his life, and shot her dead in her home. Again, Blackness, gender nonconformity, lesbian identity, and disability converge to criminalize and then produce the killing of a Black queer person and demand queer dreams of abolition futures. A few months before Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore, Maya Hall took a wrong turn, which I've frankly taken myself, off of Baltimore-Washington Parkway that takes you to the National Security Agency instead of the road that you think you're going on. And then, perceived to be a terrorist as opposed to someone who had lost her way and needed to turn around and get out. Maya Hall was killed in her car, and as a Black trans woman, again, was sort of encountering police through the haze of these criminalizing narratives and this long criminalizing history. Janisha Fonville was killed during a domestic violence call involving two lesbians. And again, similar criminalizing narratives. The important thing about her experience is that it happens in a situation where we might think, oh, but we want more police protection for queers. We want more police intervention in queer domestic violence. We want the state to act more in our names of our protection. That's actually when we win. When VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, names LGBT domestic violence as violence, that's progress, that's winning, that's a reform that is actually going to create more safety for us. And what Janisha's life and death teaches us is that, in fact, the same criminalizing narratives operate when we're talking about Black, queer, and trans people, such that, you know, responding to a domestic violence call, and in her case, the cops came in, she got up off the couch to be like, what are you doing here? I didn't call you, because her girlfriend had called them. And within seconds, she was dead. We also, as queers, some of us have been very deeply engaged in, again, asking this to see the state as a protector of LGBT people. People declared a victory in federal hate crime laws when LGBT people were named as a protected category. They were like, oh, it's the first positive reference to LGBT people in federal law. It's a win, it's gotta be a win. And, you know, Kiwi Herring was a Black trans woman in St. Louis who had experienced, you know, months of a homophobic and transphobic kind of terror campaign by her next door neighbor. And when the police showed up finally one day, when her next door neighbor had like set fire to her porch, the person who wound up dead was Kiwi. And as a Black trans woman whose Black gender nonconforming partner and 3 children were present, she didn't get protection from hate crime laws. She got the same response that police, again, through these criminalizing narratives, are set up to deliver. And so, again, Kiwi Herring's life demands that we dream queer dreams of abolitionist futures so that we can create a world where she and everyone else I just named would still be alive. So there's data showing that, you know, I've sort of shared with you a few examples of police killings of Black, queer, and trans people. There's many, many more. I don't want to sort of rehearse a litany of Black death, but I did want to name folks because and tell a few stories, because I think even in this moment of national uprising and sort of unprecedented, largest uprising against police violence against Black people in US history and in global history, we're still short on those names. I don't know, and we can talk later in the chat about how many of you knew you know, any of those names or any of those stories, and if they informed your understanding of what people were in the streets about in the last few months, and, you know, what we're in the streets about and what we're demanding abolitionist futures in their names as well. So obviously, police killings are not the only form of police interactions with Black, queer, and trans people, but what is important, as Dean was saying, is to know that a significant majority of LGBT people of all races experience some form of mistreatment. 61%, according to one survey of trans people, have experienced some kind of police mistreatment when they interacted with them, and that number increases to more than 2/3 when we're talking about Black trans people. And that's verbal harassment, that's misgendering. It's also asking inappropriate questions about, have you had this surgery? Have you had that surgery? Are those real? Is this, I mean, just all kinds of transphobic and homophobic and misogynist and ableist questions. And then sort of presumptions of criminality. You know, again, stories, one of the stories of those tentacles of the octopus is that, you know, queer and trans people are inherently engaged in the sex trade, and people who are gender nonconforming. And then, you know, what the result is in terms of physical violence or sexual violence or extortion of sex. So those are some of the statistics. We included a lot of data in the recently released "End the War on Black People" section of the Vision for Black Lives. We re-released a 2020 version and updated this particular brief around ending the war on Black, trans, queer, gender nonconforming, and intersex people, to sort of highlight how in this moment, it's not only that long criminalizing history that's informing police interactions with, that produced the stats I just mentioned, which were from 2015, but that those stats are increasing under the current political administration because of the high level of transphobia that's being communicated through things like repealing basic protections for trans youth in schools, for trans people in healthcare, for workplaces and prisons, and also continuing to expand religious exemptions that basically say, it's okay to act on those criminalizing narratives. We won't even pretend that you can't do that anymore. In fact, that's encouraged. And I think people are very much focused on 45 and don't focus as much on what 45 and a half or whatever we call Mike Pence is up to in the background, while there's a lot of sort of chaos in the front ground around increasing anti-trans rhetoric and anti-trans action that plays out in police interactions. And in many cases, people don't think that religious exemptions apply to law enforcement, but people are pushing for them to apply to law enforcement as well as to, you know, cake stores or whatever we're thinking about when we're thinking about religious discrimination against queer and trans people. So many more stats that will tell you that Black trans folks and homeless trans folks experience more arrests, be profiled as being involved in the sex trades. People experience high levels of incarceration. What that means is that a lot of people then don't feel comfortable seeking help from police when they need it, and that folks experience all kinds of assault by police when they're interacting with them, and once they're incarcerated. So LGBT people are 3 times as likely to be incarcerated as the general population. A lot of people aren't aware of that. We certainly know the stats around racial disparities in mass incarceration. It's important to know that those intersect with disparities around sexual orientation and gender identity. So most folks who have seen the 13th or read the new Jim Crow know the stat that 1 in 3 Black men will experience incarceration in their lifetimes. Most people don't know that nearly 1 in 2 Black trans people report that they, or Black trans women specifically, report that they've been incarcerated at some point in their lives, and that that's very much a product of that first police contact, rooted in all those criminalizing narratives. And so if one stat, the 1 in 3, can galvanize a national movement against mass incarceration, I would argue the 1 in 2 stat should galvanize our queer dreams of abolitionist futures. This starts early and in schools as well. I think that sometimes we think that this all sort of starts when people become adults and are fully formed queers. And in fact, it very much occurs in schools. So there's the percentage of queer students in schools is like, you know, between 3 and 5% who are self-identified. Yet, you know, the ones who have experienced discipline at schools are just way disproportionately Black, Latinx, and experience discipline for all kinds of things, dress code violations, you know, sexual codes of conduct violations, officers, you know, sort of letting straight kids make out in the hall or in the parking lot, and, you know, policing queers for holding hands in the hallway, et cetera. And also, as in the case of Jules Gutierrez, for defending themselves against bullying and homophobic and transphobic violence in the schools. So in Jules' case, she was jumped by folks at her school. She defended herself. She was the only one charged. She was the only one disciplined. She was the only one expelled. And of course, there was a national outcry about that. And then the outcome was that everyone was charged and disciplined, which is not the equality we're seeking for. So that's not a queer dream of an abolitionist future. It would be one in which Jules was supported in seeking reparations and restoration. And the entire school thought about what are the conditions that created the possibility for this to happen? How did we all contribute, and how can we contribute to shifting them? Antoinette Brown, some of you may know this story. I think I learned it at WGSS, was, or is, a Black queer gender nonconforming person who was charged after her girlfriend's mom found a sext on the phone. It was, I think, pretty milquetoast, as I recall. There were no pictures. It was kind of, you know, if we get to be alone, here's what I'd like to do with you. I'm sure that pretty much everyone on the Zoom call has probably sent something like that. At least for those of us who were younger, maybe it wasn't a text. It was maybe a telephone call or a note on a piece of paper. But there's something all of us have done. But because her mom was homophobic, the girlfriend, and it was by a phone on telecommunications, she was able to report it to the police. And because they were queer, and so the police saying, you know, kids, ma'am, you know, it's going to happen. I don't know what, instead, because it was a queer relationship, they decided to charge Antoinette with luring a minor and several other offenses that are intended to catch people who engage in pedophilia or inappropriate sexual conduct with minors, and Antoinette was facing a charge that would have required her to register as a sex offender for the rest of her life. And so she pled to a lesser charge so she wouldn't have to do that, and did 18 months in a juvenile facility for sending a sext to someone who I think was going to be turning 18 within less than a year. So that's a way in which queer sexuality among young people is policed, using laws that sometimes those of us who, might be sort of abolition, friendly or curious or thinking about would be like, but, not the sex offender laws, and what we don't realize is that a lot of queer youth are criminalized under sex offender laws in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think about. So that certainly leads to these stats that lead to disproportionate incarceration of queer folks. And the experiences of queer folks in prisons have been documented by queer abolitionists. And again, an example of a slide that maybe not be so useful on PowerPoint, but it shows that mass incarceration, not only of queer folks, not only comes from criminalizing narratives operating in police contact, but also structural exclusion from housing, from employment, from education in such a way that people are funneled into the maw of the criminal punishment system as these criminalizing narratives operate in other sectors of society. So once in prison, high rates of physical and sexual assault by staff and other incarcerated people. And intersection, as I was describing earlier, with high rates of incarceration for disabled people. So for instance, Tony McDade was a Black trans person who was also disabled, who was incarcerated in female facilities and made up one of the over half of, or almost half of people in jails for women, and almost 40% of people in prisons for women who are labeled with at least one disability or disabled in one way. We know that the high rates of incarceration for Black women and girls are connected to the war on drugs. I think we don't often think about the fact that that's true for Black trans women as well, and Black queer and trans youth generally, that again, those sodomy laws have been struck down. Those, maybe people aren't coming after them under the sex offender laws for underage same-sex sex, but they certainly are coming after them under drug laws like they are other Black youth, and certainly doing so in a way that plays on being queer and trans. So Shelley was killed by a community member after she was arrested on a minor prostitution charge, but they found weed in her hotel room, and they said, if you wear a wire to go talk to your dealer, then you could get out of going to jail tonight. And of course, everybody knows that being in jail as a Black trans woman, there's going to be at least some verbal violence at best, and at worst, likely physical and sexual violence. So this was a way of coercing her to go do something that was unsafe. And then they made it more unsafe and devalued her Black trans life by immediately telling the guy that she was the one who had flipped on him. So she turned up dead a few days later. And so this is a strategy in the war on drugs. It's one that the Trump administration has explicitly endorsed and said they're going to continue to do this. It's called going after the small fish to get to the big fish. But really what you're doing is you're putting women who are either using or low-level drug sellers in a position where they are risking violence to cooperate in order to avoid harsher punishment. And in her case, that proved to be deadly. Broken windows policing is another sort of mechanism that produces high rates of incarceration. In women's jails and prisons, about a third of people who are there are on these offenses. They're basically the minor offenses, right? They're the offenses that are enacted under the theory that, if you see a window that's broken and it doesn't get fixed, and we don't find the person who broke it and very swiftly and decisively punish them, it's only a matter of time before the entire neighborhood descends into chaos and mayhem. So we have to strike at it at the root. And there's a corollary to the theory that is, if I catch you jumping a turnstile or committing a littering, and I don't stop you then and come after you again decisively and harshly, then it's only a matter of time before you become a mass murderer. And so the way that it works then is that there's a sort of increasing number of offenses that are criminalized in public spaces, that like sitting, eating, drinking, sleeping on a train. I mean, if I was in person with you, I would ask everyone in the room to raise their hand if they've ever fallen asleep on public transit. Most people would raise their hands, and I would ask how many people had ever gotten ticketed or arrested for it. And there would be much fewer hands up, unless I was doing this at a LGBT youth center, and then everyone's hands would probably stay up. And so it's the kind of thing that also means that if you're walking down the street like DeWanna Johnson was in Memphis, Tennessee, and you know, that's all she was doing, Black, trans, and walking down the street in Memphis, Tennessee, the assumption, as the stats I had up earlier showed, and based on, again, this history that was described in the books I mentioned, the assumption was that she must be walking down the street to trade sex, even though there was no client, no money, no agreement to trade sex for anything else. They brought her into the station and beat her quite violently on camera, on video. There's video, you can find it on the internet still now, of her being beaten by police in the police station while other police are standing around and watching and participating. But, you know, in her case, that video didn't produce the same national outrage, for instance, that Rodney King's video did, or other video that we've seen. And in large part, you know, certainly local organizers said, yeah, what happened to her wasn't, we don't agree with that, but we also don't agree with who she was. We don't condone her lifestyle, right? And so there wasn't as much of an uprising around her experience of broken windows policing as there was, for instance, of Eric Garner's, who was also stopped for one of these minor offenses, selling, you know, loose cigarettes, allegedly, and killed as a result. So it's also the way that people are arrested for these prostitution-related offenses. Again, the story is, if you're queer or trans, you must be some kind of sexual freaky, and if you're standing outside doing it, then you must be doing it for money, and therefore we're going to pick you up instead of for cross-dressing for what's called loitering for the purposes of prostitution is the charge, which means standing around thinking that I might trade sex for money. And of course, you can't tell what someone's thinking when they're standing around, so the criminalizing narratives stand in for that. Sometimes having condoms on you stands in for that, which, given that we're often about distributing condoms to prevent HIV and all kinds of other STDs, literally means that people who are trying to protect themselves are being criminalized for that very reason. The similar presumptions operate particularly for gay men and gender nonconforming folks who use public bathrooms. They're going into those bathrooms for sex. I think folks know about entrapment for that offense for sort of more famous people, but they don't realize that in Port Authority bus terminal in New York City every day, dozens of young Black men who try and go to the bathroom, many of whom are unhoused, and that's a place to go, are being picked up on the assumption that they're engaged in lewd conduct, literally because they pulled something out that they need to pull out to go to the bathroom. So obviously most of us know about policing the gender binary in bathroom use. They use broken windows offenses like disorderly conduct or lewd conduct to do that. And often it's just a question of just being, you know, gender nonconforming or trans, being asked for identification as part of any kind of stop or traffic infraction, having the gender not match up on your ID, and then that escalates into an encounter where police are literally about policing the gender binary. And that was the case for Juan Evans, who was threatened with a strip search on the side of the road to assign him a gender because his driver's license said something that the officer was confused about in a traffic stop where it kind of doesn't matter what your gender is, you just get a ticket or you don't. And he went back a week later to that same police department with 100 of his friends and eventually got them to change their policy and have kind of the most progressive policy for interactions with trans people across the country in East Point, Georgia, which is just outside Atlanta. But, you know, the policy didn't change the practice. And so that necessitates that we instead dream more broadly, bringing queer dreams of abolitionist futures. Running short on time, so I just want to name that sexual violence, the kind of search that Juan Evans was being threatened by, is a form of sexual violence. There's no part of even the improper or insufficient law that exists that says you can search someone to assign them a gender based on anatomy. You can search someone for weapons, evidence, contraband. That's it. You can't do it for body parts. But that's a form of sexual violence that trans people experience all the time. But trans people also experience sexual assault, certainly in prison, but also in the context of interactions with law enforcement. So this is a hidden epidemic of police violence. We've talked a little bit about it in public, but it's not something that sort of rises to the level of police shootings and use of force in the public discourse around around police violence. But it's certainly something that queer and trans youth and queer and trans women of color experience at very significant rates. And that people also experience in other institutional settings, again, that don't get spoken about. So here, 15% of Black trans K-12 students reported sexual assault in an educational setting, half of them by a teacher or staff member. So this is something that's happening in many settings and institutions that's not being addressed. So I've talked about the fact that throughout this, there have been queer and trans abolitionist visions, organizing resistance. Certainly that is exemplified by Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, and Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, who weren't only about tearing down policing of queer and trans people by starting the first Pride Parade and having a rebellion, having a rebellion that was then commemorated by the first Pride Parade in New York City, but by creating abolitionist futures and dreams by building a house that housed trans people, trans women particularly, where people shared resources, food, shelter, emotional, physical support. Abolition is not just tearing things down, it's a project of building actual safety for our communities. And that was something that they were doing as STAR. It's something that folks are doing when they're thinking about how we organize in ways that name police violence as queer violence and name anti-Black violence against queer and trans people as part of the larger issue of police violence that we're fighting, and making sure that we're fighting from a place that understands those experiences within both struggles. It's something that we were doing along those lines when we were defending two lesbians who were beaten outside a ladies' night at a local club in my neighborhood, where we were going through the streets and sort of talking about wanting to build safety in our communities that was both for queer and trans people and for Black people from police violence and community violence, and dreaming abolitionist futures in central Brooklyn. It's also what we're doing when we're kicking cops out of Pride. You know, we're saying there's no way to turn this thing, to pink wash this thing into something that's gonna stop doing the things I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes. And so we need to understand that and understand that our dreams and abolitionist vision organizing require us to not fall for that. To recognize the fact that, as I've been talking about, when we defend ourselves from violence, in the case of LaShawn White, as a Black deaf woman who was experiencing violence in her home from another woman, called the police. And she said she needed interpretation to communicate with police when they arrived. They said it would be no problem. And then as soon as she stepped outside, there was no interpretation. She ran towards them, which is what the person on the phone had told her to do. And they brutalized her and tased her. She lived, but it was sort of this notion that even like there's no way to like shift the way that they perceived her, the way they described her was as like in a very animalistic way that was about Blackness, gender nonconformity, and disability in the way that we were talking about earlier. So that's one way that she survived violence, but then was punished by police. I think many folks know about Cece McDonald defending herself and then being incarcerated for doing that. Kai Peterson, thank goodness, was recently released, but was sentenced to 20 years for defending himself after he was raped. And then the cop literally said, "You don't look like a rape victim to me." And that's how he wound up in this situation. So people also are recognizing that, you know, the ways in which that disease spreader and queerness are colliding in HIV criminalization. People have been resisting that through an abolitionist lens that says, you know, this is not the way that we respond to health issues and conditions. And certainly, even if we are concerned about how people living with HIV are communicating with their sexual partners, criminal punishment is definitely not the way to go. That's not a queer dream of an abolitionist future. People are fighting to decriminalize sex work and sort of take away more tools of the octopus, more laws from the arms of the octopus, but we also have to, deal with those criminalizing stories and recognize that the octopus will continue to reform until we dismantle it completely, but still organizing to end broken windows, organizing to demand different responses to people with unmet mental health needs. First of all, meeting them in the first place and having, widespread available, universal, free, accessible mental health services, community-based for everyone in every form, but also to the extent that someone's aren't met, that we respond with something that doesn't involve putting people like Kayla Moore at risk. And that we think about together, what happens when I call 911 and what could I do instead? So that we don't risk that happening, because it's a little Russian roulette when you do call. People are fighting to liberate queer and trans folks from detention, and also to welcome caravans coming across the border, and understanding that the borders and immigration, detention, deportation system are very much part of the prison industrial complex and need to be at the center of our queer dreams of abolition futures. People are recognizing that, queers are affected by every aspect of the carceral state, and including Islamophobia and the ways in which that's enacted. People who are queer and trans and dreaming abolitionist futures are not only documenting the police violence that I'm talking about or have been talking about, they're leading movements to defund the police, to build a Black trans futurist framework for practical abolition as the way to liberation. So doing the work of abolition using queer dreams and Black trans futurist dreams through a Black queer feminist lens, which absolutely centers queerness and recognizes all of the intersections of structural oppressions that lead to the conditions that I've been talking about and also inform our resistance. This is a network that I helped form of organizations working specifically to end police violence against Black, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming folks and cis women who have been organizing to support justice for Tony McDade by recognizing that Tony was killed by police, but before that, Tony was incarcerated and subjected to transphobia by the state and in the community, and also, was shaped by that and enacted gender-based violence and then was punished for that, and was also disabled and labeled with unmet mental health needs, and was, so the Tony McDade's death didn't happen with a single bullet, and so the resistance has to come at the intersection of all of what contributed to that. Many folks have looked to Minneapolis as a place that's kind of been an epicenter of the current uprising and of the defund police movement, and maybe some folks don't know that it's all Black, queer, and trans people who are leading that work in Minneapolis. This is Candace Montgomery, Miski Moore, and Oluchi Omeoga, who are Black, queer, and trans people who have been from the Black Visions Collective, who have been leading that fight on the ground in Minneapolis and experiencing significant homophobia and transphobia while they're doing that. There have definitely been people who have been saying, for instance, they think BLM stands for Black Lesbians Matter because there's just too much queer leadership in the work on the ground in Minneapolis. And they're not saying that in a positive way. I would think that would be a great statement, but they're not saying that way. So I think I'll stop here to make room for questions, just letting folks know that there is this resource around defunding the police that I created with Mariam and Woods at Interrupting Criminalization. It sort of points out that defunding the police isn't just about budget cuts. It's not a budget exercise. It's actually queer dreams of abolitionist futures through defunding police, certainly, but also by shrinking police department size, scope, equipment, power, and basically stopping police departments from looting all of the resources that we need to stay safe as Black, queer, and trans folks and have queer dreams of abolitionist futures, and to stop them from being able to enact all of the violence that we talked about. There's some pitfalls I can talk about. There's some LGBT specific considerations I can talk about, but ultimately, these are the reasons, the motivations, the histories, the experiences and the futures that we can draw on as we engage in queer dreams of abolition futures. And I will stop there.
Thank you. It's funny that you end on this slide. We are about to partner with Black and Pink Seattle chapter to start writing to some folks in the state of Washington. So
makes total sense and
yeah.
not surprising to me. So I'm excited to hear that partnership. There definitely have been on the forefront of queer dreams of abolition futures long before many of us came to the table.
Thank you. So for the folks who would like to ask a question, please click on the participant button either on the top or the bottom of your screen, and then select raise hand. And that will keep them in order for Pam and I to call on folks. I know that it takes a moment for that first hand to raise, but we'll wait a moment.
I guess I'm also going to say that we're posting some things in the chat, resource guide, in addition to what Andrea just was mentioning, but we have the Invisible No More resource guide. And then if you scroll up, you can see some links to some organizations in the Pacific Northwest as well. Let's see, right up here, just FYI. So
I'm just dropping some more while we're waiting for some hands. This is where you can find the defund toolkit. And then you all are in Seattle, right?
Other side of the state.
Oh, it's the Bellingham campus. Is that where I'm going?
No, we're on the extreme eastern side. We're right next to Idaho.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Sorry.
It's our own private Idaho. Yeah.
So for folks who sometimes go back to Seattle, Decriminalize Seattle is the folks you want to support there. I'm sorry, I thought we were virtually in Seattle, so thank you.
Nishant, I see your hands raised.
Well, I only want to ask a question if there are no students who, I don't want to take the place of a student who might want to ask a question. So if there's somebody else, please call on them.
Nope, I think you would be a great person to kick it off.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk and for your really important work. I was wondering, this might be a really broad question, but if you could talk a little bit about the implications of prison abolition on aspects of social and political life that might not be limited to just prisons and jails. So for example, how could abolitionist critiques be extended to the military-industrial complex? And at least according to me, the rather misguided attempt by some LGBT organizations to be wanting to be part of the military-industrial complex, or even perhaps the tendency to offer, soft policing alternatives to prisons, such as, mental health facilities that also cage people, or even, I've seen a lot of we should call social workers, but social workers could also, be invested in punitive models that are carceral in scope. So just any, thoughts you might have on that.
Thank you so much for that question. I mean, I think that one of the points we're making Queer Injustice and that I make in Invisible No More is that if you expand the lens through which you understand policing, mass incarceration, mass deportation, et cetera, beyond kind of the quintessential subject that is, presumed to be cisgender, heterosexual, Black man who's US born, then you start to see exactly how far the octopus tentacles reach and all the places they reach in ways that then illuminate what the project of, Queer Dreams of Abolitionist Futures, how broad the scope has to be. And we start to see quickly, if you look through queer experiences of being incarcerated as disabled, as mentally diseased, as mentally incompetent, as criminally, mentally, we're close to Idaho. I mean, there was sorry, I can't remember the name of this is what happens in middle age. You're like, that thing where the guys were rounded up, you know what I'm talking about. Wow, I really can't remember, but it's in Queer Injustice. It'll come back to me, I'm sure, at 3 a.m. The Boys of Boise, was that it?
Yes.
Yes, thank God. Okay. So that history and those experiences of criminalization through the mental incarceration system, through the psychiatric punishment system, will then sort of shortcut you from making those mistakes of being like, oh, let's divert people. Let's have a public health response. Let's have a health response to it's not a criminal problem. It's a health problem. Your queer experience will tell you, like, that's also a carceral institution. We also will experience incarceration and violence there. That's not a queer dream of an abolitionist future. So actually that's part of the reason that, I mean, in addition to, because that's who I am, that my work has focused on examining these issues through the lenses of Black, queer, and women and queer and trans people, is because it actually illuminates that the child welfare system is a terrible place to refer queer and trans youth, right? It's worse incarceration, it's worse policing, it's even less process, it's longer involvement in your life, it's more abuse, it's more violence. That the medical system, you saw I show up some slides of the education system, right? People are like, oh, just keep the kids in school. It's like, for queer and trans people, school is, I mean, if 15% of trans folks are being raped at school, not so good. Don't make that a condition of probation that they have to stay in school, right? If Jules is experiencing, bullying in her school, maybe that's not where you want to then make it a condition that she has to go. So it points us to how broad and deep and wholesale our abolitionist dreams and futures have to be, and how what we really need to uproot are those criminalizing narratives, but also the values that produce policing, prisons, and carceral responses, right? So when we think about defunding, we're thinking not just about divesting financially from policing and punishment, we're thinking about divesting ideologically and emotionally from policing and punishment. And I think that looking at all these issues through queer and trans experiences gets us there faster, right? And so for the military piece, I mean, look, it's a job. It's the only job available to a lot of folks. It's often offered as like, it's prison or this, and I certainly think that for queer and trans folks who have made that choice, I want them to have all the benefits, few as they are, that come with that choice, right? It's an extortionate, horrible choice. But yes, my response is that I want so many more options, and I want that institution to not exist. And then we don't have to worry about, how it's playing out for our queer and trans siblings. So agree with you on all those fronts.
So I have just one question. I know we're out of time really, but I want to bring it back to campus a little bit. You talked and gave good information about how schools are criminalizing youth and how they're carceral institutions. And I think higher ed is involved in that too, of course. So I wanted to just, if you can identify a couple ways that maybe aren't so obvious that higher ed is a carceral institution or contributes to this larger massive problem, that'd be great.
I mean, certainly the presence of campus police is a very obvious one, and there's a campaign that I signed on to divest the UC system from policing altogether and to get rid of campus police departments. I think it's also very clear in this moment around coronavirus policing that, a queer party is going to have a different response from the corona police or the snitch lines than the frat party, right, at the heterosexual spot. So I think that there's a way that any rule, including one about large gatherings or whatever it is going to be policed differently when it comes to queer and trans folks than it comes to sort of white cis het folks, and including on campuses. And then I think there's the ways in which we police Blackness, queerness, transness, indigeneity, disability in how we grade, set assignments, and to be honest, when I've taught, I've had to really like query myself, right? If I made an assignment that was about, give me an example of Black feminism in action, and someone came back with like, here's how my sex work practice manifests Black feminism in action, and made a case for it, or here's how my drag performance is Black feminist in action, or here I've got a museum project to like document drag history, and here's my proposed museum exhibit, that, there's a more orthodox view that could be like, you didn't fit the assignment. And then there's a view that's like, you nailed the assignment, right? And we have to be willing to expand our understanding in how we respond to people's intellectual engagement and contributions, and make accommodations where needed to recognize that outside of our classrooms, our students are dealing with everything I just said, right? Everything I just described for an hour, the student dealt with that on the way to school. And for Black trans women, leaving the house is taking their lives in their own hands. So, you know, an absence policy, you don't show up to class, well, I understand, right? Let's talk about how we might be able to navigate that. So that's sort of my obvious to least obvious answer, right? Get the cops off campus, but get the cops out of our head and out of our classrooms too.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that, and for your fabulous talk and all the work you're doing. You know, we're fans, and we're in solidarity. I hope you know. So
I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be with you all tonight and to be in conversation with you all. And I'm sorry if my long-windedness kept us from having more conversation with students, but I'm certainly willing to stick around for as long as anybody wants to be in conversation.
great. I think there might be a couple of folks who might be able to take a minute more, if you don't mind.
Of course.
And thank
you. If we were in
everybody.
person, I'd be in the room, you know, as long as there were students there to talk. So we're going to do
Well,
it.
it's getting pretty late where you are.
I had a cup of coffee just for y'all.
Well, thank you. And thanks for everybody out, to everybody who came, and presenters and moderators and organizers, and, you know, hanging in there with, you know, our less than, you know, easy Zoom life these days. So take care, everybody. And again, thank you for coming out.
Dr. Ritchie, Pam, is it okay if do you mind if I?
No, please jump in, but know that I'm not a doctor. I wouldn't want to perpetrate. I'm a lawyer, but not a doctor.
Faith, I was just gonna say, I was just gonna write to you. It's fine. Go ahead. As long as Andrea, I mean, just a few minutes, because it is late for her. So.
I'm fine. Yes, carry on.
Yeah. So I'm on the faculty in criminal justice and criminology here, and I actually do a lot of work in prisons. And it's been, first of all, I love your work. The Queer Injustice, I had my grad students read that like when it first came out. And it's the first time that I saw them really pissed. I mean, they were angry. It's like, you know, they could kind of conceptualize discrimination against race and ethnicity and gender and all that. But when they read that book, it was like, I almost had to use the seminar as like a therapy session to, like, you know, just like let it out, okay? So first of all, thanks for that powerful work. But one of the things that I've been grappling with in my work in prisons, so there's a men's prison just north of here where I've done a lot of work. It has about 2,200 men incarcerated. And they've decided, the state of Washington has designated this prison as where their trans inmates will go. And it's been really interesting because I kind of wanted your thoughts. So abolition is a long way down the road. Contemporary demonstrations and pressure to change is really dynamic, and I'm looking forward to see how that goes. But I was just curious your thoughts about when a system gets forced to confront the issue of incarcerating trans men, and what, because that them grappling with it has been really fascinating and progressive as prisons go. Like, they're basically arguing, because some were like, oh, they should have a unit of their own. And this prison, the administrators went, no, it needs to be general population, manage it, and so forth. So I'm not arguing for that. I'm just saying it's an interesting time, because there would have not have even been a thought given to it 10 years ago.
It's true. And, I've been part of a lot of conversations about that. And, for a long time, I did a lot of sort of what felt like an effort at harm reduction work, right? At sort of saying, okay, this shit is ongoing, and what can we do to like take away tools of violence while it's happening, with a view to abolition, right? So I spent many years litigating and negotiating a policy for police interactions with trans people in New York. And, on paper, it was the most progressive policy in the nation. In practice, it changed nothing. It meant maybe that, when someone would call me from a precinct and be like, I'm being held in the wrong cell, or they're going to try and search me, I could say, put me back on the phone, officer, turn to page blah, blah, blah. You can't do what you're doing. Do you see what it says there? Yes. Okay. And maybe like 3 times that stopped something from happening. But I filed almost as many lawsuits after the policy passed as before. They never trained people on it. They just continued the same behavior. Mm-hmm. We had a similar sort of back and forth in Rikers about, do we want a trans unit? Do we want general population with precautions? We went back to a trans unit. Mm-hmm. Layleen Polanco died at Rikers because because of all the reasons we just described, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're on a trans unit or another unit, prisons are going to kill you, prisons are going to rape you, prisons are going to hurt you. So the short answer is we came up with, sort of the practice that we put to the Obama administration, which is like, people should be able to stay where they are, that they feel most safe. They should be able to decide that, and they should be able to change that anytime, right? Like, I want to be in the men's prison. I want to be with other folks. I don't want to be with other folks because actually that's also violent. But ultimately, the safest place for a person to be is not in a prison. And so that has been sort of the kind of ongoing drumbeat. So I think Dean makes a case in this piece that I sort of listed in my PowerPoint and then I just dropped in the chat, that like, there's been many sort of arguments for like a women's prison, a gender responsive prison, prisons with nurseries, trans pod in ICE detention. Well, the trans women in ICE detention, who were in the pod at Cebolla, were in New Mexico, were like, this place is, now they just have us all in one place and we're just literally like targets in our cell. And, they're ginning up violence between us because they want to watch this perform. Like, it just for them was like, this is just as violent, more violent in a different way. So, and then they often sort of put more resources to be like, oh, we need to build a whole new women's prison. Now we need to build a trans prison. Now we need more money for the wing to make it more trans-ish, right? Or we need to like, and in the end, why don't we just put that money into what trans people need to not wind up in prison? So I think, and it's hard. I mean, my co-author with Queer Injustice, Joey Mogul, was involved with an effort to shut down a prison, the Supermax prison in Illinois. And, they were like, abolition, shut it down. And then they would get letters from the guys inside being like, really great, the work that you're doing, so appreciate it. Could you get them to turn the lights off? Because they leave them on 23 hours and we can't sleep. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's thinking about like, what are the changes that are going to increase agency and power and possibility for folks inside to fight for themselves? Mm-hmm. And what's the thing that's going to get them out at the same time, right? Like, and how do we have to assess everything we do as like, is this going to increase your power to fight? And is it going to increase our ability to get you out? And the nicer the gender responsive trans fancy prison cell is, the easier they're going to say, oh, well, this is a good place for people to be, right? But the safer people are, the easier it is for them to fight to get out. So we have to sort of be on that razor wire all the time and try and be guided by the folks who are inside, but also help them expand their dreams of what's possible, is my long-winded answer.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I just want to say I appreciate your work, and it is making a difference. Working inside prisons, and it doesn't always feel like it, but there's a lot of churning and things going on that I think are headed towards a positive direction. But like you, I'm always a little skeptical. So, but thanks.
Well, thank you for that. And thanks. The experience that you described of people reading Queer Injustice and being mad and / traumatized by it. It's why we made the study guide for Invisible No More, because my own experience of like doing talks around it, I remember like going somewhere and kicking off a talk by like reading from the prison chapter that starts with Roderick Johnson's case. And I just read a little bit and looked up, and the whole class was like flattened, right? And I just was like, okay, maybe this is like, we need a different approach to this, because I think I've just demobilized a bunch of people, right? And when I first met Jason Leiden, the founder of Black and Pink, similarly, we went to, you know, a Black and Pink meeting in Boston, and we're like, started off our conversation about queer injustice as it is. And Jason was like, yeah, you can't, this can't be, you need a different approach that's, one, lifting up, like not leading with the violence and recapitulating the violence, but that is more resistance focused. So I tried to learn that with Invisible No More. And I also tried to give a study guide to be like, here's a way to read this book. One, don't sit down and read the whole thing in one sitting. Two, like maybe read it in a different order. Start with the resistance chapter, maybe read the back end of each chapter, and then like flip through the rest. Like try different options. And there was definitely stuff in there for instructors of like how to hold what you're saying, like the support group that folks are going to need for reading it. So anyway.
Well, just one more quick thing, and then I promise to let other people speak. But, you know, in criminal justice, I really powerfully believe they do need to feel the work, because if they don't feel it, it's too easy to abuse that power and to not understand. And so on the one hand, I hear what you're saying, but at least within my discipline, I'm sort of in this space where you got to bring it and they have to feel it. And hopefully they are angry about it, because that is what will initiate that change. So I appreciate that. I have a long drive, so I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you so much.
Good night. Safe drive. Thanks for doing the work you do.
Thanks, Faith, and thanks to the rest of you. And I think this is our moment to sign off. Thank you very much, Andrea.
Thank you.
And we, yeah, carry on, right?
Thank you so much, and you all carry on out there where you know, you're living in dangerous times and dangerous places. So I'm sending you all lots of strength and love, and take good care.
Thanks everybody for coming out tonight and your work. So hang in there. I know it's mid-semester, but we're doing fine. So hang on.